Today I want to talk a little bit about victim blaming and rape culture. I get a lot of comments from people saying that rape culture doesn't exist in the Western world because we have laws against rape and we punish rapists here.
Well, I, for one, am glad that we are done here, Marina. It's gratifying to see that you understand that we have a culture in which violence against women and violence in general is punished adequately and appropriately, especially sexual violence. Without your help explaining this, I don't know that we would have gotten through this.
Which is true that we have laws against rape, but that doesn't mean that those laws are necessarily effective because the vast majority of rapists never see jail time.
Now, what Marina is asserting in her statement that the vast majority of rapists will never see a day in jail or never be convicted or what have you, it's actually adequately covered in this RAINN infographic and the dissection of that infographic by permutationofninja.org. And I'll provide a link in the low bar for anybody that needs a little bit better understanding of their dissection. I'm going to hit the high points. In the small number of cases of stranger rape, there may be some small number of mistaken identifications, which can lead to issues with accurately assessing who is responsible. If a report is filed in one jurisdiction but is required to be tried in another jurisdiction and has to be refiled, this can potentially inflate the number of reported incidents. Alibis might come out that indicate the innocence of the individual who is alleged to be the perpetrator. The DA may not feel that there's sufficient grounds to pursue a case. Plea bargains to lesser offenses might be made, which means that the alleged perpetrator is not being convicted of rape at all. The allegations may not be ones that qualify as rape by legal definition, at least in some jurisdictions, whereby, for instance, two people get drunk and make dumb drunken decisions. And the other thing to consider is that because of the length of proceedings involved in any rape case, an individual may serve a considerable amount of time while awaiting the end of the case. If they plea to a lesser charge, they will likely have served the entirety of their sentence in custody. And if an individual is acquitted, they will have served time for an event that they have not been found guilty of. This also entirely ignores any and all social repercussions that exist simply for being accused of rape, and it ignores the fact that, according to the CDC, 40% of individuals responsible for non-consensual sexual aggression are females, if you wanted to be intersectional, I guess.
But that isn't what I want to talk about today because that's a whole other subject in itself. If you want to hear more about the legalities surrounding sexual assault, I'll link to some videos where I discuss this more below. Something super important that
Well, it's a good thing that permutationsofninjas.org did such a thorough job of dissecting what your claims are likely to be based on. And frankly, the only concern I have with the legality of rape or legality of rape culture is the way in which it treats male victims as non-victims. So maybe you could focus a little more on that in another video where you actually explore the plights of all victims of rape, as in the ones that aren't counted by US legal definition or East Indian legal definition or Israeli legal definition or British legal definition, or the countries in which the resources that were available to male victims of rape have been slashed to zero, like in Britain with Survivors UK.
I want to point out is that rape culture doesn't necessarily mean that we as a society condone the act of rape or think that it's good.
If as a society we don't condone rape or accept that it's good, then I suppose we're done here, Marina? Or did you have more? Oh, of course you have more.
What rape culture does mean is that we normalize rape and we make excuses for it.
Wait, didn't you just say that we don't condone rape or treat it as good? I mean, normalized and make excuses for it? That's condoning it. That's rationalizing it. That is exactly the opposite of what you just finished saying.
We blame rape survivors for their own victimization, and we tell women that because they didn't behave or dress in a certain way, that it's their own fault for being sexually assaulted.
Telling someone that taking action or not taking action has caused them to become a victim is victim blaming. Telling somebody that taking or not taking certain actions will reduce the possibility of becoming a victim is not victim blaming. It's a subtle but really important difference.
But it didn't always used to be this way, right? Wait, no, it totally did. I'm going to share with you guys some old school examples of victim blaming, or in some of these cases, Old Testament. I think it's important that we examine the history of rape culture critically, because then we can further examine what our current ideas about sexual assault are actually based on.
At some point, Marina, are you planning on critically examining the culture in which even an allegation of rape can cause men to lose their families, lose their jobs, and lose their lives? Because that's sort of a big deal.
Let's go to ancient Babylon 4,000 years ago. The Code of Hammurabi, or Hammurabi's Code, was a set of nearly 300 laws governing ancient Mesopotamia. This code laid out everything from a range of punishments based on social status to how much money you should pay your ox driver. This is also where we get the popular saying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So what does one of the first sets of written laws have to say about rape? Well, if you were a virgin who was raped, then it was considered property theft against your father, and the rapist was to be captured and killed. But if you were a married woman, regardless of your lack of consent, you were considered an adulteress and had to share the punishment with your attacker, which at that time period meant being bound and thrown into the river.
What this history lesson is actually teaching us, Marina, is that we no longer live in a society that treats women as chattel, and that even 4,000 years ago, societies considered rape to be absolutely reprehensible and punished it as stringently as possible. What this history lesson is actually teaching us, Marina, is that we no longer live in a society that treats women as chattel, and that even 4,000 years ago, societies considered rape to be absolutely reprehensible and punished it as stringently as possible.
Why is this relevant today? This might seem like an extreme example if it wasn't something that's still happening. Obviously not the being bound and thrown into the river part, but the chastising of women's sexuality.
Let me go on the record really quick here. I, for one, really happy that we're no longer tying up women and throwing them into the river alongside their rapists. That said, the presumption that women are the only ones who are ever chastised for their sexuality is laughable. Men are frequently bombarded with chastisement about their perceived undesirability, and the most frequent culprits of those sorts of messages are sex-negative feminists and fundamentalist Christians who will chastise anyone that they believe is outside of their highly rigid norms about sexuality.
Our views of virginity and women's sexuality aren't terribly different from ancient Babylonian times. Also, quick note, I acknowledge that virginity is a made-up social construct that ignores the sexualities of queer and trans people and other sexual minorities.
I would argue that our perception of female sexuality has moved an incredible distance since Babylonian times, since we now acknowledge the sexual agency of women. And concerning the arguable status of virginity as a social construct, the definition is the state of never having had sexual intercourse, which seems pretty intersectional. It doesn't specify a gender, it doesn't specify a sexuality, it doesn't specify anything other than the state of never having had sexual intercourse.
But I'm also recognizing that this construct did and continues to have very real effects on the lives of women in the past and present. Today, if a rape survivor is expected to be taken seriously, then they need to be considered a respectable woman. This is why we see so many questions of a woman's promiscuity brought into play if she chooses to make allegations against her rapist.
Now, I find the implications of those statements to be reprehensible and disgusting. To imply that the overwhelming majority of rapists are male, and to ignore that nearly 50% of rape victims in the US are male, and to ignore the vast numbers of male rapes in prisons, and to ignore that 40% of rapists are female in the US, is doing more to excuse and perpetrate rape culture than anything you've complained about thus far. The fact is that if a man is believed about being the victim of a rape, he's frequently told that he must have enjoyed it or that he was lucky. That's disgusting.
If a woman is promiscuous or has too many sexual partners, then people make excuses for her assault because she was asking for it. The basic message behind this is that a sexually active woman doesn't deserve to be in control of her own sexuality and her own body. And if she is violated, then it's her own fault for ever having been sexual in the first place.
Who precisely are you suggesting is making these claims that sexually active or sexually promiscuous women deserve what they get. That's frequently a narrative I hear coming from sex-negative feminists, but I don't hear it coming from a lot of other corners of society. And are you suggesting that the police should not act with all due diligence in an attempt to properly investigate the allegation? Are you suggesting that we eliminate due process and presumption of innocence? Because that's kind of what happened to the Duke lacrosse players. That's kind of what happened to Brian Banks.
Now let's take a look at the ancient Hebrews. According to Deuteronomy, married Hebrew women were also to be held similarly responsible for their own violation. However, even a woman who was a virgin risked death by stoning if her attack happened within city walls. The reasoning behind this is that if she had screamed for help, then someone would have heard and come to her rescue.
If you're going to Deuteronomy looking for legal advice, Marina, you're going to have some issues. I mean, things like mixing fabric and clothing, crossbreeding animals, planting different seeds in the same field, sleeping with another man's slave. Oh, and it's fine to make a slave of anybody that's not an Israelite. So that's kind of a problem. Let's see, what else? Having sex with your mother, your father's wife, your sister, your granddaughter, your half-sister, your biological aunt, your uncle's wife, your daughter-in-law, your sister-in-law. Having sex with a woman and also having sex with her daughter or granddaughter. I mean, we're not using Deuteronomy as a legal basis for our modern society at all, ever.
Flash forward to 12th century England, where King Henry II wrote similar instructions for the way the court should deal with the sexual assault of virgin women. According to King Henry, a rape survivor was to go at once, while the deed is newly done, to the neighboring townships, and there show the injury done to her, to men of good repute, the blood and her clothing stained with blood, and her torn garments.
What your history lesson about King Henry II of England is failing to capture, Marina, is that at the time, rape was incredibly harshly punished. Not only would the rapist be put to death, his horse and dog would be castrated, and his hawk, if he had one, would lose its beak, tail, and claws, and any property turned over to his victim.
While the idea of a rape survivor being forced to run yelling through the streets immediately after such a traumatic experience and then go show a group of men her bloodied clothing sounds awful, this is essentially what rape survivors are expected to do today.
Where do you live that women are forced to run through the streets, screaming, clutching torn clothing, and bleeding? I'm sure that most people have access to a cell phone in the event of an actual rape. And it's my understanding that when a woman reports a rape, she is attended by a female police officer and female physicians during the process of any evidence collection.
Rape survivors are supposed to immediately collect evidence of their attack if they ever plan on testifying against their perpetrator. And if they wait too long to testify, then it evokes suspicion about their motive.
It's the responsibility of law enforcement professionals and any medical professionals that become involved in the allegation to collect any evidence that may be present. The only responsibility that the victim has is to ensure that they don't interfere with the scene of the alleged crime and to take steps to preserve as much physical evidence as may be possible to gather, i.e., don't bathe, don't douche, don't change your clothing.
And the reasoning that a rape survivor could have prevented their attack by screaming for help only mirrors modern-day victim blaming with statements like, "Why didn't you call for help?" or "fight back." It places the blame on the survivor for their own violation rather than on the perpetrator who violated them.
Interestingly, asking a person why they didn't raise a hue and cry is commonly not intended to blame them, but to point out that they would have suffered less victimization had they attracted attention, because most criminals, especially people who victimize others, look for targets that are easily victimized and don't look like they're going to put up much of a fight.
The last example I want to talk about is the infamous story of Potiphar's wife in the Bible. I might be saying Potiphar wrong. Potiphar's wife is basically depicted as being very sexual and lusting over one of her slaves. When the slave rejects her, Potiphar's wife, who of course is unnamed, accuses him of sexually assaulting her. The story of a woman crying rape is popular in a lot of other folklore, including the Quran, Celtic myths, and Egyptian folklore. The narrative of a vindictive woman who uses rape as a tool of revenge is still a popular stereotype today. It's also important to note that false rape accusations are relatively rare. The FBI estimates between 2% and 8%, which, by the way, is less than false accusations of theft, which the FBI estimates at 10%.
I've been unable to find anything about the FBI reporting false allegations of theft at 10%. However, the 2% false rape allegations number is attributable to Susan Brown Miller, and it's been proven to be false. At the other end, we have Eugene Cannon claiming that 41% of rape allegations are false. It's also been proven to be methodologically inaccurate. And admittedly, your 8 to 10% is roughly accurate. But to think that you're hand-waving the destruction of the lives of 8 to 10% of men as though it's somehow okay to do so is absolutely sickening.
But nobody ever stereotypes robbery victims as vindictive liars. What's particularly dangerous about this myth is that it paints rape survivors who try and report their assault as untrustworthy, making it even harder for them to get any sort of justice. It also shows the historic concern that the biggest victims of rape culture are the hordes of upstanding men being falsely accused left and right, rather than, the actual survivors of rape.
So not only are you falsely equating the crimes of theft and rape, wherein it's demonstrable that one is visibly worse and has a much greater impact on its victims, but you're also displaying what appears to be an utter lack of empathy to the 8 to 10% of men whose lives are destroyed by a false rape allegation. And I mean, beyond the Brian Banks and the UVA frat and the Duke Lacrosse and the Hofstra University and Occidental College and Paul Nungessers of the world, there's men that are beaten to death and killed over false rape allegations. And it's as though you sincerely believe that it's not a vanishingly small minority of men and women that perpetrate this crime, but it's the majority of men lurking like predators, waiting for a moment of inattention or the simplest opportunity to spring out and perpetrate this crime.
Anyway, I think that these historic examples are extremely telling about where our current attitudes about sexual assault come from. And also pretty frightening when we consider how little we've progressed in the last 4,000 years.
Are you totally certain that we've made no progress in 4,000 years? Because a couple of your examples, had you taken them a couple steps further and talked about the punishments that were levied for reports of rape, would indicate that societies throughout recorded history have treated it as one of the most abhorrent and vile crimes possible, and we still treat it as one of the most reprehensible crimes imaginable. The only thing worse than rape itself is the rape of a child, and a rapist and a child rapist are the two lowest forms of life in a prison. It's as though you don't understand exactly how seriously the charge of rape is considered in Western society.
This is why it's so important that we view modern-day victim blaming in a larger context and not as something that's just a recent phenomenon, but something that's been occurring throughout most of, if not all of human history. We also need to be conscious of modern victim blaming when we see it and call it out whenever possible. We need to critique our cultural attitudes, our legal system, and any part of society that allows rape culture to happen in order to create change and to challenge our culture of violence.
So you'd like us to examine our culture and our society and our attitudes and our legal system in order to figure out where it permits and propagates and encourages rape culture? That's the first thing that you have said that I have 100% agreed with. And I'm going to start with the FBI definition of rape, which still only refers to penetrative actions as rape. Made to penetrate is not considered a form of rape. It's considered a form of sexual assault at best. How about the feminist narratives that continue to claim that 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 women will be raped in college, when it's actually 0.61% of female college students will experience a sexual assault or rape, as opposed to 0.76% of females outside of colleges? How about the men that have no access to post-victimization services throughout the U.S.? It's almost impossible for a man to find any kind of resources to help him deal with the trauma of being sexually victimized or victimized by an intimate partner. How about the men in the military who still don't dare to speak out about being sexually assaulted and raped? How about the 50% of college men who experience unwanted sexual acts? How about the men who are ignored or laughed at or told they wanted it, or that men always want sex? How about the narrative that paints men as nothing but base sexual aggressors and completely ignores the male victims and the female perpetrators of sexual violence? That little thing at the end, Marina? That little splash screen? Look at it long and hard, please.